my lovelies, thanks for joining me today. Oh, today's case. It might be one from 2004, but it is absolutely breathtaking in the evil that is essentially associated with this predator. Honestly, strap in. It is one of those cases that genuinely will make you question humanity, as so many of these cases do, but certainly this is one of those that's right at the forefront, just for the pure evil running through the mind of the perpetrator. Also, I think it's going to really highlight how no matter where we are in society today, and don't get me wrong, I think there is so much more equality in so many different paradigms and ways, and we care so desperately for all of that, and it's such a good thing. But still, even today, I think that there are some assumptions made about the gay community, the male gay community, which are really unfair, and that at times lead to investigators potentially not giving the same attention to certain individuals who go missing. Again, everybody is welcome to their own feelings. I'm just saying that for me, it's a little bit like when I talk about cases which involve sex workers. These people are incalculably important human beings to the people who love them, to the people who like them, to people they spend time with. And yet, when they go missing, sometimes there is a reluctance to engage in the same level of care about the case as they would be, for example, if it was a young mum who goes missing. And some people will say, well, that makes sense because of lifestyle choices, but I would always argue that every single one of you who comes to this channel is just an unbelievably important human being. We all have different gifts in this universe. We all are brought to this earth with a set of different variables, circumstances, privileges, problems, and we start off on those starting blocks in different places. And essentially, if something bad happens to us, then people should give us the attention that we deserve, and every human being deserves that attention, full stop. And I know that a lot of people have commented on cases where, for example, a young woman has gone missing who looks a certain way compared to another young woman who goes missing and looks a certain way, and essentially they get a completely different service. I think it's really important to just highlight those issues when we see them. Also, before I kick off with the case and go into detail, just want to say a massive thank you to those of you who are supporting me on my YouTube membership and my Patreon. Without you, I can't make these. I hope you're enjoying your extra full-length videos. And if you like what you see here, please do subscribe, give me a like. Apparently, it's really good for the algorithm. That's what my eldest son says. He's very young and therefore he seems to know these things. So I'd really appreciate if you did that. Let's talk about today's case. So this case kicks off on the 6th of January 2004. And the reason for that is the police find the body of a decomposing young man inside an SUV in Tampa, Florida. And when they start the investigation, all I can say is it reveals two of the most disturbed serial killers that Florida has ever seen, and also two serial killers that basically terrorized its gay community for many years after they were brought to justice, or at least to a certain form of justice. So let's go into the background of this case. So let's talk about Jason Galehouse. So Jason Galehouse was 26 years at the time of his disappearance. He grew up in the Sarasota area. He moved to Tampa, Florida in late 2003. And the reason for that is he wanted to live with friends. He wanted to experience a more liberal life, have an experience of new opportunities, and just create a new world for himself. And he was somebody who talked to his mother every day. He was described by people who knew him and loved him as this really outgoing, creative, charismatic young man. He was working as a florist, which clearly identifies immediately that he's somebody with a creative flair. I mean, literally, if I were to try to arrange a even bunch of flowers, it would be a failure. So this individual is somebody who's artistic. He'd also really thought about his future. He'd enrolled in college classes because he wanted to do interior design. And the reason for that is he actually wanted to start his own business, designing custom furniture pieces. So we are talking about someone who's grabbing life by both hands, and he is somebody who is artistically gifted, and he's doing it. He's really doing it. We get to Friday the 19th of December 2003. At this point, like a lot of people around that time of year, Jason goes to a Christmas party in Tampa. He's with some of his friends, a guy called Justin Laughlin, Jeffrey Lower, and a guy called Tony Bragg. Now, they decide at that point they're going to go to a local gay club, 2606. Now, this is the most popular gay club in the area at the time. And as 2606 begins closing for the night, Jason goes over to his friends and says he's basically met two guys, he's planned to go home with them, and that's fine. It happens every day of the week. But the problem here is that Jason does go home with those two guys, whoever they are, and then they don't hear from him again. His friends literally never see him, never hear from him after he leaves the club. So they are really worried, and they end up reporting him missing a few days later, which is absolutely terrifying. He's just missing in action. Nobody knows where he is. Then we have a guy called Michael Wachholtz. He's 26 as well. He grows up in Tarpon Springs in Florida, moves to Tampa literally just a few months before December 2003. He, at the point in time, was waiting tables at the Bahama Breeze restaurant. Apparently, he'd had a few more issues in his family because he'd basically come out and they didn't react very well to him coming out, which must have been so devastating. He'd only recently resumed contact with his mother, who lived in Missouri. He was actually described by people as being a really friendly, outgoing type. He enjoyed Tampa's nightlife, but one of the things that people said about him, he was quite private about his personal affairs, but you would imagine that that makes perfect sense if you've come out to your family and it's gone really badly. Because I guess psychologically, if you can't trust those people who you've grown up with, who intimately know you and you believe love you with your sexuality and be accepted for that, then I guess the idea of trusting anybody can become really problematic. Now, Michael was living in an apartment with a friend, a guy called Frederick Van Den Abiel, and in December, Michael actually agreed to dog sit a guy, and in that December, Michael had actually agreed to sit, and in the December of 2003, Michael had actually agreed to dog sit Patches for his close friends and also his former roommates, the Hartfords. So he's basically going to go and spend some time there looking after their doggy. So on the 20th of December 2003, this is after Michael finishes his shift at Bahama Breeze, he leaves Patches with his roommate for the evening and he tells Frederick that he's going to go clubbing at 2606, but he'll be back home later that evening. He never returned. This is really unusual. The last person to hear from Michael was actually a friend, a guy called Pete Carahalios, and Michael texted him at 1:30 a.m. on the morning of the 21st of December, and he said, "On my way home." So clearly, he's going directly home. You wouldn't be texting somebody to say that unless that was your implication, that you were going to return. But he doesn't get home. When it becomes clear that Michael hasn't arrived, friends and families start distributing flyers in the local area. People want to know where he is. They want to find him. And with respect, you can imagine, can't you, the horror that people who love him are feeling, because it is out of character. He goes out, he says he's going to be home, and then he doesn't get back. You're going to immediately suspect the worst. Because on the 6th of January 2004, Michael's body's found. It was 17 days after he disappeared. And the reason that they found him was he was actually inside his own SUV, which was parked outside an apartment complex off West Hillsborough Avenue. Michael's body was really, really badly decomposed. He was found wrapped in a printed fitted bedsheet. He was stuffed literally in the cargo compartment of his own Jeep. There was just something so unbelievably disrespectful, isn't there? I mean, somebody's taken his life, then used his own vehicle as some kind of macabre coffin. Understandably, 17 days shoved in that area of the car is going to cause decomposition at a high rate, and it does. So they can't actually determine his cause of death. But let's be clear, obviously, it's a highly suspicious death. Why would he end up in a duvet, dead, in that compartment of his own Jeep if it hadn't been incredibly suspicious? I think that everybody would be aware at that point it's a homicide. Now, the police, they knew that Jason and Michael had basically gone missing from the same club one day apart. If you are a dyed-in-the-wool investigator, your immediate concern is going to be, what kind of predator is out there? Two guys going missing one day apart. That's going to immediately raise those concerns among law enforcement. The Tampa Police Department, the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office, and the Tampa Field Office of the DEA, they go ahead and launch a joint investigation into the disappearance of Jason Galehouse and the murder of Michael Wachholtz, because clearly they're deeply concerned that something untoward is happening with an individual or individuals who are potentially hunting these young men. Now, the police, they start interviewing literally anyone who attended the 2606 on the nights of the 19th and 20th of December 2003. And the reason for that is, of course, they want to piece together any details they can about Jason and Michael's last movements. Now, multiple witnesses recall each of the men left with another man or men matching the same description. But in particular, the recollection is it's an older white guy that they've left with. So detectives then start thinking to themselves, well, we're probably then dealing with a single perpetrator. You know, individuals are more connected with the idea of seeing these young men leaving with an older white male that maybe is one predator that we are dealing with. And numerous witnesses end up pointing police in the direction of a guy called Steven Lorenzo. He matched the description of the man that both Jason and Michael had been seen with on the 19th and 20th of December, respectively. So, first of all, he's a regular patron at gay bars and clubs throughout Tampa, particularly that club 2606. He also lived at 213 West Powhatan, which is only a 10-minute drive from 2606. Significantly, however, what was really ringing alarm bells with the investigators is this guy was known for his predatory behaviour. So lots and lots of men in the gay community had literally been warned, stay away from him. And you have to just conceive of what that sounds like when you actually play it out in your head. I mean, we've all been around people who are maybe a little bit untoward in their behaviour. Maybe people have said that they're not the best person to have a relationship with. You know, we've been in situations like that, but we're talking about literally groups of men telling other men, this is a guy you need to steer clear of. He was known, for example, to have spiked men's drinks in the past, and we all know that when people are spiking you, it's not because they want you to have a good time. It's because they don't necessarily want you to be present when they're doing god-awful things to you. Spiking happens across the board. It doesn't matter whether you're black, white, brown. It doesn't matter whether you're male or female or whatever in between. The point is, perpetrators are out there and they know how to use these drugs to essentially incapacitate you. And you are completely incapacitated when somebody spikes drink, aside from the fact that often you're absolutely terrified because you're not aware of what on earth is happening to you. And yet here we are 2004 and 2005 and we don't seem to be that much further on. And you just think about if you have a predator on the loose, that's a pretty terrifying timeline. The first search warrant was actually executed on the 8th of January 2004. And what they found during that execution of the search was drug paraphernalia. They found large quantities of GHB and ketamine. If you think about GHB in how it's referred to commonly, it's known as the date rape drug. And the reason for that is it just renders you unbelievably helpless. Ketamine is a relaxant as well. Obviously, it's something that's used as anesthetic or a painkiller. It's even used in treatment for deep depression. So ketamine has its purposes, but only with the correct professionals administering it for the correct things. But we're talking about a drug that can be incredibly dangerous if it is with somebody who doesn't understand dosage and doesn't use it for the correct purposes. Now, when the forensic teams did some of those searches, they uncovered traces of blood in areas literally throughout Lorenzo's home. By the way, later, that is found to be a match for Jason Galehouse, but that's later. What they also found during those initial searches were various restraint devices, and they were clearly meant for things like BDSM and torture. And I appreciate that people out there are into BDSM, people are into DOMs and subs. And if you are a consenting partner and you have safe words and you don't get horribly injured, you have a right to do what you want to with your body. But we're not talking about somebody who wants people to consent. We're talking about somebody who wants to actually carry out impact on individuals who are not consenting. That's what's titillating Lorenzo. And it became absolutely evident early on that Lorenzo really did want to hold his victims captive after he's incapacitated them, that having psychological, physical, emotional, complete control. The police took so much digital evidence, so they took numerous stacks of hard copies of AIM chats between Lorenzo and multiple people online just to kind of evidence that he was involved in a subculture that was questionable at times. And it turned out that Lorenzo also had multiple different account names. One was Constern Man, and he was basically talking to multiple men. and he was talking to them about drugging other men, using GHB to do so, taking them back to his place, sexually assaulting them. And one of his main titillating points was that he had this idea of keeping these men as permanent slaves. Lorenzo actually said to one man, he will drop, we'll take him back, we'll strip him, tie him, and use him as we please. I know a few locations where they're younger and willing to party. He then asked, what is the youngest you have effed or R'd? So you can fill in the gaps of those words that I'm using. But even though some people will say, well, this is online, and with respect, online, there are a lot of people who live in fantasy state. Of course they do. I mean, there are whole second lives that people live online. And that doesn't mean you're actually going to go ahead and do anything horrendous. But clearly, the police are looking at this information and feeling that this feels very much something that's physically occurred. This is an individual who is desperate to dominate human beings, desperate to control human beings. And he has the materials around him, the BDSM and torture items, and also the drugs that he can use to succumb these individuals. Now, they also turned up that he'd spoken to another guy called Cargo Pants Dude 22. This guy was seemingly a potential victim. So they're talking about him getting drugged with GHB. He's actually saying, well, you'll only need a tiny amount, but we'll see later if it's cool. So some of them potentially are consenting, but for the most part, that certainly isn't where Lorenzo's mindset is. Now, investigators managed to download photographs that had been stored in Lorenzo's computer and his camera, and they seized this in one of those particular search warrants and found, wow, the most disturbing cache of nearly, just wait for this, guys, 500,000 images of men who'd basically been restrained and abused and sexually assaulted. I mean, 500,000? Just think about your own collection of photographs on your phone. That's almost like a full-time job. And we're talking about something very niche here. We're not talking about taking pictures whilst you're going to work with the lovely landscapes, seeing your friends and taking snaps of them, taking pictures of your kids, you know, the things that you might do multiple times a day. We're talking about a very specific area involving sex and domination, and there's 500,000. Now, among that 500,000, there were 20 photographs that were actually time-stamped, literally, within a few minutes of 5 a.m. on Sunday, the 21st of December, 2003. And those photographs showed what looks to be the lifeless and sometimes really badly contorted body of Michael Wachholtz. So this showed evidence of sexual battery as well. It's clear that this young man has not been consensual in this situation. And when he's shown these photographs, I kid you not, he's not like, oh yeah, they're obviously photographs that are taken in my apartment because I took them. He's like, no, yeah, they do seem to have been taken at 213 West Powhatan, which is my address. And you are correct. It does seem that one of those photos appears to include my hand posing Michael's lifeless body. But the problem I have is I can't actually recall anything happening in the early hours of the 21st of December 2003. So it couldn't possibly be me. At the end of the day, I don't have a recollection of posing this particular young man with my hand in the photographs, it being actually in my home at my address, and it essentially clearly being me involved. No recollection of it. So did it actually happen if I don't remember it? So this is what this guy is going to be saying. He's basically going to be denying the reality of this, at least at this point. He gets arrested because of that drug paraphernalia, etc. on the 17th of February 2004. He's charged with drug possession and distribution at this moment in time because there was a large amount of drugs that they found and that didn't seem for personal use. So specifically, he was charged with 9 counts of distribution of GHB with the intent to commit a crime of violence and 1 count of conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute GHB. So those 9 counts were in regard to Jason, Michael, and also 7 other victims who had come forward after Lorenzo's arrest. He was then held at Hillsborough County Jail because, believe me, there is absolutely no way this guy should be walking the streets. Now, during the ongoing investigation, the police find that Lorenzo had been talking to someone called Master Scott. Now, he's later identified as a guy called Scott Schweickert. Now, the chats, they indicate that Schweickert had met him online in October 2003. They then met face-to-face in Tampa on several occasions. So they hadn't met that long physically before these young men have disappeared, but nonetheless they are in contact. So they have plans to meet at Lorenzo's apartment on the 19th of December 2003, which is obviously a date that stands out to investigators. Messages also indicated that they had this mutual desire to drug and also forcibly engage in dominant sex with unsuspecting men. So they have taken it from those discussions that people engage in as a fantasy and brought it into an actionable reality. So understandably, when the police get this, they're like, we need to bring this guy in. And they do on the 10th of May 2005. He's brought in for questioning. And he's questioned by Anthony Pacelli. Anthony Pacelli is from the US Attorney's Office, and also he's questioned by Chuck Masucci, who is with Tampa Police. So he's asked, understandably, how did you meet Lorenzo? And he said, we met in October 2003. We met through a mutual friend. Schweickert told the investigators that initially Lorenzo had actually lied to him and said his name was Anthony, not Steven. And his name at the time online, as far as Lorenzo's goes, was Dom Dude for Sub. So they essentially create a friendship based on what could be said is their compatible sexual interests. Both of them enjoyed dominating submissive gay men. That was their main predilection. And they talked for about 4 to 5 weeks before they ended up meeting in person. Lorenzo was slightly older than Schweickert, but also I would say that what Schweickert could tell about Lorenzo was that he was far more engaged in their mutual interests. He'd obviously carried out things before. So where you could say Schweickert had fantasies, Lorenzo had genuinely real life experiences, and he was titillating Schweickert with this and saying, listen, I can bring you into this world. So Schweickert actually makes plans to drive to Tampa from Orlando on December the 7th to the 8th, 2003. That's where we lived, to meet up with Lorenzo. This is where they end up going to 2606 together. Now, prior to Schweickert's arrival, Lorenzo had apparently made contact with another guy online and they'd set up a meeting for the three of them. And the intention of that was to participate in a Dom-Sub experience. Now, this man's name is disclosed only as O'Rourke by police. And the three of them did indeed meet up in the parking lot of 2606, where apparently they talked through each other's car windows for about 5 minutes. Then they all head back to Lorenzo's house. Now, there's no insinuation of drugging in this incident. Apparently, O'Rourke was a willing participant in the threesome. Schweickert said that not long after they arrived back at Lorenzo's house, they end up tying O'Rourke to the bed with leather restraints. Then, towards the end of the session, apparently O'Rourke became uncomfortable. They had to apparently stop. Now, O'Rourke said the reason I became uncomfortable was because I ended up having a rod inserted into my penis and I was being sexually assaulted by Schweickert while Lorenzo was basically caressing and calming me and trying to keep me in that state where I'd accept it. Now, Schweickert says that wasn't true. There was never a rod inserted into his penis and that the three basically parted ways without feeling any negativity or any lines had been crossed. I think we can all agree, why would this person who had consensually gone back and gone ahead in that apparent dom-sub relationship for that short period of time be like, I was really uncomfortable, a metal rod had been inserted into my penis, I'm going to imagine that that's going to stand out in your memory. There are going to be guys out there right now listening to this and wincing because you're just thinking about what that would mean on a pain threshold level for you. And I would imagine that O'Rourke probably remembers that because it was something that he wasn't happy to have happen. And the very fact that he's been coerced into this situation, they're trying to calm him down where he's obviously dealing with problematic pain, that speaks volumes to me. Now, Schweickert apparently returned to Orlando the same morning that had all played out. Now, obviously, what we're talking about in that situation was at least to some degree a consensual experience, but I don't think for 1 minute that Lorenzo enjoys consensual experiences. If you are a true sexual sadist, if you're an individual who genuinely enjoys that level of power, if you have the dark triad of personality traits, and I genuinely believe that Lorenzo has Machiavellianism, he has psychopathy, he has narcissism, he's definitely a sadist, which is what they'd like to add to that triad, then you have an individual who really does not want you to have any enjoyment whatsoever when you are being horrendously, sadistically abused sexually. He doesn't want a consenting partner. That takes the fun out of it for him. Now, when Schweickert is talking to the investigators, he starts to recall about the 19th of December 2003. He's come back at this point to Tampa for another weekend with Lorenzo. He said he basically arrived at Lorenzo's house in the afternoon of that day. Gets to 9:30 p.m. They end up going to drinks at a bar called Metropolis, and then they go clubbing again at 2606. Bear in mind, it's one of the most popular gay places to go. They end up getting separated. So at this point, they start talking to different people. Towards the end of the night, they find each other again, and Lorenzo introduces Schweickert to a man who he said wanted to come back to the house and play around with him for a while. So Schweickert says, I could tell looking at him that that sort of play just meant it was going to be a sexual thing. It wasn't going to be a dom-sub thing. So he's indicating this young man thinks he's going to come back and have some fun, but has absolutely no idea of the lair that he might be walking into. Now, bear in mind, at that point in the evening, no one knew his name, but that man was Jason Galehouse. When they get back to Lorenzo's apartment, the three of them start having consensual sex, which is why Jason has gone back there. It's unclear exactly what happens next, but Schweickert ends up going to the bathroom midway through the experience. He comes back into the bedroom and then sees that Lorenzo is on the bed with Jason in a sleeper hold. So he's looking at Jason. Obviously, we have Lorenzo who's got him in that sleeper hold, and he immediately realizes, well, he looks really unconscious. Schweickert then says to Lorenzo, what are you doing? And the response of Lorenzo is, I've done it lots of times. Don't worry about it. It's perfectly fine. As if choking someone out, which is just so unbelievably physiologically dangerous, because it's the fine line between life and death. Anybody who's been choked out will know how terrifying that experience is. And also, people don't always come back from it. But he tells Schweickert that Jason is going to wake up in around 15 minutes, which again would be unbelievably dangerous and damaging. 15 minutes to be out cold? That is brain damage scenario playing out. But Lorenzo doesn't care. Now, Schweickert at this point says that he's going to get ready. He needs to drive back to Orlando. And as he's getting ready, he's thinking, do you know what? It's been more than 20 minutes and this guy is not waking up. So Jason was showing no signs of life. They then go and check on him, and Jason isn't breathing. Schweickert then checks for a pulse, couldn't find one. And he then says to Lorenzo, what the hell happened? Lorenzo responds chillingly with, well, it's something I've always wanted to do. I've always wanted to kill someone. Now, at that point, what would you do? Because I am telling you, if I was in a situation where I consensually returned to have a threesome with somebody, and during that period of that threesome, I've gone to the toilet, returned, and I've seen that this particular person that we were all engaged with consensually has now actually done something very dangerous to another participant in that session. And then I realise after a period of time, the person that they've harmed isn't waking up because they're dead. I may in that moment be like, oh, well, sorry, I'm going to have to leave you to deal with this. And I might get myself out of that building because, hey, at the end of the day, if somebody has just killed somebody whilst you have been present, there is an implication about you being there. Secondly, your fear will be, if they can kill this person, well, what is different about me? So I can completely understand that you might not in the moment be like, I am ringing 911 because you're fearful for your own life. But you would ideally withdraw from the situation and then get emergency services because, my goodness, if there was any way of saving this person, you'd want that to play out. If there isn't, you definitely want the perpetrator to get immediately arrested because you want this kind of killer off the streets. And also your own conscience would just be pricking and you'd be saying to yourself, I have just gone through a really traumatic event. I need to resolve this on an emotional and conscious level. That's not quite what happened. Schweickert agrees to help Lorenzo dispose of Jason's body. Now, if you were an innocent party in any situation, why would you do that? Why would you agree to dispose of a young man's body? And not just that, the way they do it is unbelievable. They take Jason into the garage, they lie him on a plastic tarp, and then they dismember his body with an electric power saw. I don't know about you, but I don't have those items on a regular. If somebody were to die in my home. Even if I decided I wanted to dispose of their body, I genuinely wouldn't have an electric power saw that could do it. And I certainly wouldn't have tarps that I could just lay out to make sure that that would occur. But apparently they have it all at their fingertips. They end up cutting off his limbs, they cut off his head, they put the pieces into 6 separate bags, and then they scatter those pieces throughout Tampa. They put them in dumpsters, which are outside different apartment complexes, which just tells you the level of disrespect that they have for that young man. Your family is never going to get to hold you again. Your family is never going to get to say goodbye to you. Your family is not going to be able to find you so that they can come and pay their respects. It's not going to be possible because you've been put in dumpsters all over Tampa. Now, of course, both men now claim that it was the other person who actually dismembered the body because that's very convenient. It wasn't me, it was him who was doing all of this horrible dismembering. Of course, it goes without saying, when you're trying to say that you're the innocent party, even when everything is pointing to your guilt, you are going to try to deflect onto somebody else and say it wasn't your responsibility. Now, Schweickert, after he's done this, ends up staying until the following day. And you would think maybe during that period of time, he'd have some reflection. Maybe Lorenzo and Schweickert would be thinking to themselves, oh my God, what have we done? That's the most horrific reality that we're now going to have to deal with. We've killed somebody. We've cut the body up. We've literally dumped him in dumpsters all over Tampa. No, that's not what they were thinking. There was no pricking of conscience. There was no deep regret, because on the 20th of December 2003, they both go out again. And they both go to 2606, their perfect predatory stomping ground. Here, they meet Michael Wachholtz. At this point, they also convince him to come back with them to Lorenzo's house. So he ends up following Schweickert and Lorenzo back to Lorenzo's house in his own vehicle, which is a Jeep. Now, once they get inside, it was basically Schweickert's job to distract Michael while Lorenzo makes him a drink. And of course, that drink is, as you will all suspect, spiked with GHB. He said at that point he wants to go to the bathroom. When he comes out, Lorenzo's basically undressed, and Michael has actually used cuffs or at least rope to restrain this young man's hands behind his back. Lorenzo then gets a can of maximum impact. It's a type of popper, and that popper contains ethyl chloride. He actually sprayed it onto a handkerchief. Then he holds that over Michael's face, and he does that until Michael becomes unconscious. When Michael wakes up again, he's still restrained. He's restrained with duct tape over his mouth. And at some point during what followed, which was clearly a horrific sexual assault, and this sexual assault occurred because they had managed to combine the maximum impact and the GHB and put that into his system, which meant that Michael was absolutely rendered helpless. And because of this mix and the assault, Michael begins convulsing and stops breathing. Literally, these guys haven't just killed one person, they're now on their second in the same amount of days. Now, apparently they were disturbed at this point by the dismemberment from the night before. Not enough to not go and kill somebody else, but apparently enough that they didn't want to repeat the dismemberment. They thought to themselves, we're not going to cut up Michael's body. So instead, Lorenzo cleans his body up, wraps it up in a fitted bed sheet. They then gathered any of Michael's items, they put them in bin bags, and then they put the bin bags and Michael's body into his Jeep. They then drive it to an apartment complex and they leave it there. All the while, they wear gloves because they want to avoid leaving fingerprints inside the car. Schweickert actually told the police that Lorenzo seemed really proud of what they'd done. And at this point, he said, you know what? I genuinely think Lorenzo had killed before. There was just something about his confidence, something about his pride in his work that made him feel, as an onlooker and also somebody who was a co-conspirator in this case, that there was more to Lorenzo than met the eye. This wasn't his first rodeo. Now, the police searched the garage during their investigations because they'd been given information by Schweickert, and when they do that at Lorenzo's house and it's approved, they use preliminary serology testing, and during that period they find indications of blood on the garage floor comprised of these cobblestone bricks. So the bricks are then sent for DNA testing, and they're sent so they can be compared with the DNA profile of Jason Galehouse. A woman called Susanna Ryan tested those bricks. She's actually a DNA expert at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. And she said that the blood on the cobblestones matched Jason's DNA. So absolutely stands up to what Schweickert is saying about dismembering him on that garage floor. She also said that the chances of that DNA sample belonging to anyone else is 1 in over a trillion. So I think we can all agree they know it is indeed linked to Jason. Also, they found a gas mask in the garage. Ryan found Jason's DNA inside that gas mask, but unfortunately, literally no parts of Jason's body have ever been found, which is a travesty and a tragedy and just adds to the heartbreak of the family. So let's talk about the first trial. The judge presiding over it was Richard A. Lazara. The prosecution was led by U.S. Attorney Jeffrey Del Fuco, and Lorenzo's defense, wouldn't have wanted to be him, was Donald Harrison. That began back in November 2005. Now bear in mind, at this point, the state police are still building the case against Lorenzo with regards to the actual murder charges. So in 2005, 2006, at the first trial, he was only tried for the drug-related charges. But believe me, they're not going to go easy on him for these charges. And there are lots of reasons why. Because clearly the police have asked about Lorenzo and whether others have had any experiences of this man doing unspeakable things to them. And boy, did they come in their droves. So let's talk about Jared Paragoy. He said that in July 2003, he's living in the Tampa Bay area, frequently goes to the 2606. One night, in the first 2 weeks of July 2003, Jared basically arrives at the 2606 about midnight. He meets Lorenzo there. Around 2:30 to 2:45, they end up going back to Lorenzo's house. When Jared gets there, he's offered a glass of wine. Of course he takes it. Why wouldn't you? He's drinking it. But he thinks to himself, you know what? There is something weird about this. It tastes off. It tastes salty. And then he said, all of a sudden, I started to feel really sick. So I ended up going to lie down on the bed. I asked for some water. Lorenzo gives me a bottle of Gatorade. And again, I start drinking it. It's extremely salty. And then I start getting sicker. I went to the bathroom to be sick. He said that Lorenzo then followed him into the bathroom. And he said, at this point, I heard what sounded like a zip tie close. And suddenly I feel this intense pressure on my neck. And then he realizes he's got a zip tie around his neck. And it is so tight, he can't even get his fingers into the zip tie to try to alleviate the breathing issue. So it's too tight. He's unable to release it. Understandably, he passes out. When he finally regains consciousness, Jared is literally lying on his back with his pants around his ankles next to Lorenzo's bed. And he said that he felt like at that moment in time, he just had this intense pressure to go to the bathroom. He had a lot of pressure on his rectal area. And he actually ended up removing this really large butt plug that he hadn't consensually agreed to. And he managed then to get into the bathroom. He was bleeding a lot in the rectal area. And he actually had 2 lines going all the way around his neck that were also bleeding. That indicates the kind of pressure that zip tie had on his neck. He also made it clear that he never consented at all to any kind of sexual activity with Lorenzo. He didn't consent to having a zip tie placed around his neck or a butt plug put into him. It was a horrendous experience. Then we have Albert Perkins. He said that in the 3rd week of February 2000, he was also at a bar when Lorenzo comes over, starts making small talk with him. Albert said, look, I recognize this guy. I'd seen Lorenzo out socially before, so there was a familiarity about him. And Albert ends up having a conversation with Lorenzo, basically saying, look, I'm looking for my friends. I don't know where they are. And Lorenzo says, oh, I do. They're having this get together. I know exactly where they are and I can actually show you how to get there. But he said, listen, I need you to leave your car at my house because there's limited parking at the location. So essentially it's a way of making sure we can both get there and park. When they get to Lorenzo's house, he says, just if you don't mind, I'm going to go and use the bathroom. So why don't you come inside? So Albert understandably thinks he's going to go to this get together. There's no big problem. He's seen this guy around. So of course he goes inside. Again, he's handed a glass of red wine. And he says it just tasted a tad funny. And at that moment in time, he thought to himself, maybe it had been corked or turned. And I think the thing about red wine is we've all probably had good red wine. We've all had bad red wine. When I was younger, for example, didn't have a lot of money, you'd have bad red wine. And there is something quite bitter about quite poor quality red wine, and there is something smoother about the more expensive. And so when you are drinking a bad quality red wine, you might think it tastes a little bit funny. But if you've been gifted it by somebody who's just being a nice host, it's going to feel a bit negative to say, oh, I don't really like this. So he kind of sips it, and shortly afterwards, his vision becomes really blurry and he passes out. When he wakes up to the most terrifying situation. He's got duct tape over his eyes and his mouth. He's face down. His arms and his legs are bound. There's some sort of rope or twine around his neck that's actually connected to his genitals. He said that he knows without a doubt the attack went on for hours. He wasn't conscious for that entire time. And the reason for that was Lorenzo was choking him into unconsciousness throughout that process. And during the time that he was conscious, Lorenzo was hitting him, beating him, pinching him. And Albert said he was just pulling on whatever he'd tied to him as well. Now, when Albert regained consciousness, he said he would look to the side and Lorenzo would basically be seated beside him masturbating. So this guy gets off on you in a non-consensual way being violated. That's his main MO sexually. Then we have the testimony of Joseph Lake. He said he met Lorenzo at a popular gay bar named Metropolis in November 2000, and they were basically sitting at the bar drinking. Lorenzo asked Joseph at this point if he wants to do some coke in his car. Now, before they go to his car, Joseph goes to the toilet. He leaves his drink at the bar at that point with Lorenzo. When he gets back, they both end up going outside. They get into the vehicle. And he said that he gets to Lorenzo's car and that is literally the last thing that he remembers from that evening. He later regains consciousness in Lorenzo's house. And at this point, Lorenzo is on top of him. They're both naked. And Joseph said, at no point did I ever consent to any sexual activity with Lorenzo. I was going to take some coke in the car with him. There was absolutely no indication that I was interested in him sexually at all. And yet here I am, naked, with this guy violating me in a place I didn't even know I'd arrived. Then we have Sergio Iturbe Garcia. On the 9th of November 2001, he meets Lorenzo at 2606. Now that evening, Sergio is speaking to Lorenzo and another guy. Lorenzo then says, listen, why don't we go back to my house for some drinks? So they agree. They get back there. At that point, Lorenzo offers him a shot of alcohol. Now, Sergio said he assumed it'd be liquor. He said, but it didn't taste like alcohol. Now, shortly after he takes that shot, the other person leaves Lorenzo's house. Sergio then starts to feel really dizzy, lies down on the sofa. And then he, like so many of the others, says the only bits and pieces I remember, because I was just unconscious for most of it, but the parts that I do recollect just felt like something like an electrical charge or some kind of electrical shock on my legs. And I also saw that Lorenzo was masturbating. So this really hazy memories, but he knows that things were happening to him that were painful and that he wasn't asking for. When he fully regained consciousness, he's lying on the floor of the living room, he's completely naked, and he said, I felt pain throughout my body and throughout my anus. When he was finally able to actually get up and go to the restroom, he had a scar on his penis. He had a couple of burn marks in between his legs. Also, he noticed signs that he'd been tied up on his wrists and ankles. He realized that his underarms, his chest, and his pubic area had also been shaved. I mean, guys, what are we talking about here? We are talking about a predator of the highest level. This man is not just a killer and a rapist. He is that predator that every single one of us is terrified of ever coming across. This is an individual with an insatiable appetite to psychologically dominate and destroy in certain cases. It is harrowing beyond belief. Then we have Joey Alva. He testified that he met Lorenzo 5 or 6 times before the incident that occurred that really left him scarred. So it was around Christmas 2002. He goes back with Lorenzo, who's familiar to him. He thinks they're going to smoke crack cocaine, have a drink. Lorenzo tells him at this point that he's got a friend who would pay $500 to $600 for a video where, quote, you get all kinky on it and tie your arms up. Joey was saying at that moment in time, he was feeling pretty messed up. He'd had this drink off Lorenzo and it had made him feel a bit weird. But he ends up thinking, well, it's $500 to $600 and I kind of know this guy, so what's the harm? So he agrees to having his hands tied up for the video. Now, as Lorenzo starts tying his first arm, Joey said, look, I started to feel really wheezy. I tell him to stop, but then he passes out. The next thing he remembers was waking up on the bed and, as he puts it, all messed up. And that poor man was later shown pictures by law enforcement that had been taken whilst he was unconscious. And he said, look, I did not consent to any of the activities that are shown in those photographs. Bear in mind, there were things like having duct tape on his ears, on his face, wearing a gas mask, having plastic binding around his body. And he said, I don't remember any of that. I certainly didn't consent to any of that. Then we have Juan Ortiz. He met Lorenzo on the 17th of May 2003 at 2606, said they spoke for about an hour. Lorenzo, as we expect with his MO, says, come back to my house for a drink. Juan then goes back, has 2 glasses of red wine, but notices that the second one just tasted a little bitter. Thought maybe it was because the bottle had been opened for a long time, maybe that's why it tasted like that, but didn't really give it any other conscious thought. Did notice that he felt really drunk, really lightheaded and very dizzy. Then he said, look, I remembered lying down on the floor around 5 a.m. Then I remember waking up around 7. He said, I genuinely thought I was having a nightmare because he felt like he was trapped in something. He said that I thought I was having a nightmare when I was screaming and I was moving and I couldn't actually move. But then when he opens his eyes, to his horror, he realizes he's literally tied up on the floor. Lorenzo then drags him by his feet into his bedroom. Juan struggled against Lorenzo apparently at this point for hours, but Juan became so tired, he just couldn't fight any longer. Lorenzo then ends up tying his hands behind his back, putting duct tape on his mouth and eyes. Again, he passes out, wakes up around 5 p.m., lying back to back with Lorenzo, and he said, I just felt like somebody had beaten me up. When he showered, he actually realized he had bruises all over his body, particularly on his hips. He also realized yet again that he had also been shaved everywhere. Then we have the testimony of Christopher Leah. This is just insane, isn't it, that we're talking about all these people who came forward? Because for every person who comes forward, think about all the men who didn't come forward because they were embarrassed or ashamed or they felt they deserved it. These are all things that victims go through. I mean, the fact that so many of these brave young men came forward to tell the truth about what happened to them is amazing, but so many will have been silent. So Christopher Leah testified that he met him whilst he was staying at the Suncoast Resort in October 2003. On that particular evening, the resort hosts a social gathering. It's about 4:30 p.m. Christopher and Lorenzo, who didn't know each other at the time, they end up going. Around 11 p.m., Christopher's just alone at the bar, he's talking to another person. When that person leaves, he's initially by himself, but the next thing he knows, Lorenzo's there on his right. He said, it didn't take long before I started to get dizzy. I felt as though I was going to fall down. He said he really didn't realise that anything was going on until he got back to his room. He said Lorenzo came in and then he refuses to leave when he's saying, look, you need to get out of my room. He also testified that he genuinely felt like he couldn't move, and as far as he felt, he was psychologically and physically paralysed in that moment. And he felt Lorenzo pull his shorts down, and he felt his back area being manipulated. He also said that he felt like he was starting to be tortured. But again, he loses consciousness, wakes up around 8 or 9 a.m. the next morning, and said he felt a little bit of pain in his rectum area. But when he looked in the mirror, his bottom area was basically purple and bruised really badly. When he returned home, he ended up seeking medical attention, and he was ultimately told that there was a lot of bruising, but nothing appeared to be torn. It was just very stretched out. But can you imagine knowing that something really awful has happened to you, but not being able to recollect in detail what's played out because you've been spiked in such a way? Now, when it came down to the defense case, which I would say they didn't have one, but nonetheless, they're going to try, they were like, oh yeah, all of this happened. Yeah, all of this happened, but it was all consensual. All of these guys have come forward and basically been willing to put themselves on the line and be questioned and have to relive the trauma. They've done that because it was all consensual. Said no victim ever. I mean, clearly these individuals have come forward because they are traumatized by the horror of what they went through. But the defense are basically saying they wanted it. How many times do we hear this in rape cases? They said, listen, they willingly participated in bondage activities, and that's why they're here giving evidence at a trial, because they were willing to do this. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever, but they've got to go for something as far as the defense are concerned. We get to the sentencing, Friday the 30th of January 2006. It doesn't go well for Lorenzo, and rightfully so. He's sentenced to 200 years in prison. That was the maximum sentence that could be given. Judge Lazara basically said, your actions are utterly heinous, and said there is no way you are not going to pose a significant threat to society if we ever release you, so I'm going to make sure that you are not released. Now, after the sentencing hearing, Brian Winfield, who's the spokesman for Equality Florida, said he's really pleased with the results of the federal trial, but he wanted to ensure that murder charges go forward. So yeah, this guy's going to be in prison forever. He's never going to get out, but we want to have those murder charges pitted against him because he deserves to be seen as a true killer that he is. And he also said, listen, I feel it was police homophobia that had hindered the investigation and the prosecution. He said, we used town hall meetings and press releases and other means to help victims who might be intimidated by possibly homophobic officers to come forward. They said now the gays community's relationship with Tampa police had grown stronger and that they had a mostly open communication with the state attorney, but nonetheless, they were kind of bringing forward the fact that there had been issues before where young men and gay men per se were struggling to feel that they could have those open conversations with the police because some of the police struggled with their sexuality. At least that was the mindset that they felt existed. I'm not saying it was absolute. I'm not saying it was completely correct. I'm saying that was the feeling, and a feeling is very integral to how people act. If you think a certain way, it's going to affect the way that you reach out and ask for support. And certainly if you have those issues where you're thinking that the police are looking at you in a derogatory way, you're not going to ask for the support that you deserve. Equally, there will be a lot of police officers who may have been tarred with that brush who just don't feel that at all. It's just that the uniform and the history makes people have that belief system. Now, when it came down to the murder charges, it was a little bit more complicated because, yes, Lorenzo's convicted in 2006 for the charges we just talked about, but he actually manages to avoid state murder charges for over a decade. And the reason for that is just down to these legal and procedural delays. Now, prosecutors, they initially sought the death penalty. They argued that Lorenzo's crimes involved sadistic premeditation and extreme cruelty. They went ahead and presented extensive evidence. So the testimonies from other victims, the communication that there was between Lorenzo and Schweickert, and also, of course, Schweikert's confessions, which genuinely detailed the gruesomeness and heinousness of these crimes in detail. We get to 2016. Schweickert takes a plea deal. Of course he does. So he agrees that he's going to testify against Lorenzo, and the reason he's going to do that is he'll get life imprisonment rather than facing the death penalty for his involvement in the murders. So he's basically saving his own skin. So the case against Lorenzo, therefore, really relied heavily on Schweikert's testimony. Now, Jason's poor mother, Pam Williams, she actually addressed Schweickert in court before he took that deal. She was holding a picture of her son and she said, Schweickert, I want you to take a good look at this picture. Take a good look at it and look at it every single day. I hope you remember this. I hope you burn in hell for this. You took my only son's life away from him. I don't have a grave, a body or a tombstone. I have the city dump with my son grounded up like some hamburger meat in the dirt. I hope you're satisfied because I hope you rot in hell. I think we can all agree with his mother in this moment that we feel similarly. We hope that you rot in hell too, because I don't think there's a redeeming possibility for the actions that she's just described. Now, when it came down to Lorenzo's legal tactics, and there were tactics, in spite of all of this massive evidence against him, he's just using all these different legal strategies to delay proceedings. One of the things he does is attempt to represent himself. He invokes a sovereign citizen defense. So he questions the court's authority over him full stop. Now, this is actually a tactic that's commonly dismissed by courts. It's an ungrounded situation in law, but nonetheless, this is what he's trying to do. He also claims that his interactions with his victims were consensual. So he's actually trying to push that idea that the defense used in the 2005-2006 trial, that everybody wanted it. You know, if they all wanted it, why were they in court testifying against you? Because of the fact that they were traumatized by your actions because you did it to them without their consent. But this is the tactic he's using. He also said, listen, the use of drugs like GHB, they were all consensual, even though these guys were horrifically bruised and broken and didn't have many memories aside from being horrifically bound by this human predator. We get to the 6th of December 2022, so there's been a hell of a lot of the passage of time since those original charges. Lorenzo is now 63 years of age, and boy, we are talking about 2 decades, aren't we, at this point? 2022 is almost 2 decades from those original murders. So at this point, he decides to change his mind. So after years of fighting the case, he goes ahead and he pleads guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. He actually handwrote a 16-page paper from inside prison, which is just, again, the description of a complete narcissist, isn't it? You know, in that document, he's saying, you know, I've changed my mind, I accept the charges, and I actually want to be put to death, and I want to waive my right to an appeal. So he wants to be in control, even if that is in control of his own demise. So he wrote, regardless of whether or not there would have been a trial, the end results will prove to be identical, simply because the defendant has no intention of taking the witness stand under oath or at trial. And therefore, the state's case against the defendant would have gone unchallenged anyway. He also then reaffirmed the decision in court to Hillsborough Circuit Judge Christopher Sabella. He said to the judge, I knew what I wanted to do with this case right from the start. Said he basically just wanted the chance to look over all the evidence before he went ahead and did so. Sabella then said to him, you do realise there are only 2 possible sentences to your plea, life or execution at the hands of the Department of Corrections. Lorenzo responded, exactly. He also said that facing a death sentence doesn't bother him. Really? Really? I think it might. I think it might. I think at this moment in time when you feel in control, you're thinking to yourself, I'll be fine. I'm just controlling all of this. I'm a massive narcissist. And essentially, I'll control my own demise. But how are you going to feel the moment that you take that last breath and Lucifer is there, escorting you down to the fiery depths of hell, where you're going to spend an eternity? I don't know. Having things shoved in places that you don't like, that are very, very hot. Literally, forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever. But anyway, he hasn't really conceived of that possibility, it seems. Now, the judge explained that he couldn't simply sentence him to death, that there had to be more hearings, rightfully so. It's a big deal putting somebody to death. And there's also a lot of contradictions in this case because Lorenzo actually a year earlier had actually tried to plead no contest to the murder charges if he could essentially be granted a life sentence. Now, in his request back then, he called the death penalty childish. It's just very childish. Sorry? Yeah, it's a childish thing. It's childish. Give me life. Why? Because what you did was exceedingly evil and wicked and premeditated. Therefore, we could put you to death. But do you want to? Well, I think quite a few people, particularly the family members, may think, yeah, we do want to. But would you really want to? I think on a straw poll vote, yeah, a lot of people would. But would you really want to? Probably yes. I'm just saying it's very childish. I'm not sure the death penalty is childish. I think it's like really serious. And I think there's reasons why they have lots of appeals and they have lots of people looking into these things to make sure it's absolutely the right decision. But I'm just saying it's a very childish decision. You shouldn't do it because you'll all be pathetic and you need to mature because people who put people to death are obviously emotionally immature and unschooled, unlike me, who's a grown-up. Genuinely, do you just want to antagonise the authorities by calling the death penalty childish? Understandably, the person who got that request was like, rejected. That's how childish I am. I'm just going to immediately reject it. Oh, you're calling me childish, are you? I'll show you what's childish. I'm not even going to read it. But the prosecutors are also fine with the new decision, understandably. Now, many immediately voiced their suspicion at the way Lorenzo had acted. Jason's mother, Pam Williams, she said that she didn't trust Lorenzo at all. She said he's pulled so many things. I just don't trust him, so we'll see. Then Carrie West, who is the president of Tampa Pride, said, it's not going to be an ending to this. There's a surprise happening. So they're all just on edge because they're thinking to themselves, Lorenzo is such an arrogant individual. There's no way he's going to want to be put to death. Anyway, we get to the death penalty phase. Those proceedings were conducted without a jury. Lorenzo apparently waived this right because he just thinks at the end of the day he's a super important person, doesn't want to be judged by a group of people that are strangers to him. You know, what right would they have to make a decision over his life or death? So essentially it's Judge Sabella who presides over it. Lorenzo also represented himself. And that actually took place in February 2023. And again, what does that speak of? What kind of an idiot's like, you know what? I know the right person to represent myself in this really important life or death case. Me, the person with absolutely no training. At the end of the day, I'm the perfect person to go ahead and do that. Did you actually know what happened to Ted Bundy? Yeah, he did the same. Yeah, he also got executed in January 1984, just throwing it out there, but maybe you haven't thought about that because you're too concerned with maturity and issues with being a grown-up as opposed to all these childish people who are, making those kind of life and death decisions. So during this death penalty phase, the prosecution called Ruth Wachholtz, who was obviously Michael Wachholtz's mother, and she began by remembering her son as being a joy to be around. She said, "He was my firstborn, the light in my life, such a good kid." Michael was such a good kid, hands down. He wasn't perfect, but oh, did he have a heart? He was a friend to all. She said Michael's brother is only 10 months younger, and it was like he lost a twin. It affects him to this day in how he does things. My whole family has a hole that will never be closed. That includes me too. And she actually got the chance to directly address Lorenzo, and boy did she. She said, an eye for an eye. It would be nice if we could have old-time justice, hanging. Have them watch the gallows being built, firing squad, not blindfolded, guillotine, again, not blindfolded. What he did to my son before murdering him should be done to him. Unfortunately, our modern justice system is not like that. It allows people to sleep, eat, play, have shelter and be clothed for free. Even after the events of this week, it will continue for a time. He should no longer breathe. My son doesn't. So why should he? He is lower than a snake that crawls on the ground, and if found, it should get its head chopped off. At least where I'm from, it should. For 20 years, he's breathed and lived. And Michael hasn't. It's time to end this. Wow. I don't know what I would say in a situation like that, but I hope to God it would be something as eloquent and absolutely direct and meaningful as what she said. Jason's mother, Pam Williams, by the way, she was currently battling stage 4 cancer when she took the stand. She said, he was a sweet, kind kid. He had a great personality. Everybody liked him. When he went into a room, he just lit up that room because he had that charisma about him. He had this beautiful singing voice that got cut short. I want that man to get the death penalty and nothing less. You are the scumbag of the earth. And I cannot believe how you can sit there with no remorse, not one sorry. No, nothing. I can tell you right now, I am sick to my stomach just to look at your disgusting face. Yeah, that's right. Make a face, you creep. You can just hear, can't you, the absolute rage within, the wanting to take him on in that moment. Now, Lorenzo refused to cross-examine the state's witnesses. He also refused to call any witnesses of his own. Instead, he just went ahead and submitted a 147-page document to the court to serve as his side of events. It gave the prosecutors also a chance to question him on what he put forward. Of course, he claimed that both of the guys came back willingly to his home. They both willingly drank the alcohol. They both willingly did drugs with him. Also claimed that there were 2 other men present during Jason's murder. Said the other 2 were experienced BDSM masters, while Schweickert was just learning. Then said it was a mercy killing after Schweickert became too rough during BDSM. Said Michael accidentally overdosed, wrote that he was shocked and stunned that was yet a second dead body laying right in front of them, literally within 2 consecutive evenings. I mean, this guy is a joke. This guy is a joke. If we were talking about in a different circumstance without the deaths and the horrible violations, it would almost be funny because it's ludicrous. He has literally picked up all of these men who've come and testified and said he did horrendous things to them under the influence when they had not consented. And yet here he is saying, no, it was all consensual. I didn't really do anything. And I was shocked and horrified when these bodies turned up in my flat. Now, every single question about those claims were met with the same answer. I'm not going to answer that. So when the prosecution are asking him these questions, he just doesn't elaborate. Now, when it came down to the closing arguments, surprise, surprise, Lorenzo decided not to be present because he's a POS. Instead, he basically asked to have some time to prepare a sentencing memorandum. Can you see how he's just trying to control all of these events? This is not about what has played out. regarding the killings. This isn't even about the death penalty phase. This is about him holding court. It's about him feeling like he is an important part of these proceedings, even though he is a nobody, even though he is a predator, even though he is the one that ultimately is going to probably find himself in some kind of chamber of death at some point. But that's just going over his head. He likes the self-importance of this situation, and he likes being able to show the utter disrespect to the families by not going to the sentencing. Now, prior to that actual decision, Lorenzo had asked if he could address the court, and he said that he was seeking the death penalty so he can fetch myself a new body and come back again in a fresh body. He even said, "We're eternal beings. The sooner I'm euthanized, the sooner I can come back. I've got better things to do with my time than hang out and spend the next 15 to 20 years on death row or in any prison system. So that's what I'm asking for. It's selfish, but that's what I want." Now, I don't know whether you know anything about Buddhism, but let's just imagine that reincarnation is going to occur. You're going to come back as a rock. And not even the kind of rock that people find and go, "Oh, it's a nice rock. I might keep that and look at it, and it will remind me of the nice time I had at that beach." I'm thinking more about a rock that people look at and go, "Ooh, I don't want to touch that." And he will have to work up to, I don't know, grain of sand over the next 2 million years. That's if you believe in that particular sense of reincarnation. Personally, I think that he's going to find that there is another life, it's an afterlife, and it's going to be a very hot one. Now, Judge Sabella responded, "I don't know if what you say is perhaps some sort of reverse psychology, nor do I care. I will not consider what you want in issuing my sentence." Judge Sabella actually responded to this and said, "I don't know if what you say is some sort of reverse psychology, nor do I care. I will not consider what you want in issuing my sentence." I bet the judge really wanted to add, "Do you think that's childish?" But probably didn't feel that was appropriate, because it might have been a bit childish doing that. But I would definitely have wanted to say that. Now, bear in mind, the families had been waiting for justice for 20 years. And the judge then said, "Today, the long wait ends." In the words of Miss Pam Williams, from one Italian to another, "Vi condanno a morte." That translates to, "I sentence you, Mr. Lorenzo, to death. That is the punishment you deserve for these horrific crimes." Which I think is an incredibly powerful message to give to Lorenzo. You might have thought you wanted the death penalty. You might have hoped for it in those moments where you felt so superior. But when you hear those words of that judge letting you know that your time will come, and it will come in a way that you don't have any control over it, maybe all of those thoughts that you had leading to those decisions you were making and taking won't feel quite as positive as you may have assumed they would when you felt the center stage. I think that judge is very clear. When it comes down to facing that moment, it doesn't matter what you believed you would feel. The chances are you're going to feel incredibly small and incredibly scared. And I'm sure that when it comes down to Lorenzo, all the families who have been affected by the horror, all the victims of his horrific abuse, they all 100% want him to feel exactly what I've just described. That and a sense of absolute terror. Because at least then, at least in his final moments, maybe he just be able to connect with the way that those victims felt, with the way that those poor young men at the very beginning of their lives felt when he was snuffing out their very existence. The world is a safer place without Steven Lorenzo in it. And in the UK, we don't have the death penalty. And so we don't have sentences that play out the way that they will play out in this case. But my God, if anybody is deserving of that kind of end, then Steven Lorenzo 100% is. Let me know your thoughts on this case. It was breathtakingly awful, wasn't it? Let's be real. We're talking about so many affected, and there will be so many more who hadn't come forward to tell the police about the horrors they endured with Steven Lorenzo, but there will be many. The likelihood is he's probably killed before, and we'll never find out who those individuals who lost their lives at his hands were, because we've seen ultimately what he was capable of doing when it came down to what happened with Jason. It is a harrowing reality that these predators live within the shadows, and sometimes you are unlucky enough to be the person who meets them when they strike. See you again next time, guys. Take care, and I hope we all agree, where Steven Lorenzo is concerned, his breath is not required on this planet.